Well, we're heading towards the end of quarantine from COVID-19 pretty soon. Makes me think, what technologies are out there that can prevent us from another pandemic lockdown? Hi, this is Takatoshi Shibayama, host of the Future Design Podcast. I run a blockchain solutions company, but I'm always searching for new technologies and ideas to improve our lives. Today I have Pieter Fourie, a senior researcher at the Future Cities Laboratory, who's back in our show to discuss what Singapore has been working on in smart city initiatives to combat pandemics. There are many applications ranging from AI, IoT, and image censoring that we talk about, including the privacy matters that surrounds this topic. So stick around to the end.
Future Design Podcast.
So I've heard about this company in Canada called Blue Dot. That it's a company that predicts with not social media, but other datas on the news, foreign languages, and even global airline reservation data to predict pandemics. And they actually predicted that the COVID-19 was happening 9 days before the WHO actually found out about it. So
Blue Dot.
you're working in the area of smart cities, AI. So what can you tell us about what's going on in Singapore and the projects that you're working on?
So Singapore has got a number of initiatives, mainly driven by government, currently for dealing with COVID-19. So we know about things like Trace Together, which is this smartphone app that you put on your phone, and basically you need to keep the app open if you at least if you have an Apple phone, and then what happens is it does a Bluetooth handshake with other phones that are also running the app, and that means then that they can get some idea of the contact network and who's getting in touch, with whom and where. And at what time. So that can then be used in contact tracing. That's a very active approach, and it has fallibilities because, like I said, you need to keep the app open. Those Bluetooth handshakes don't just happen, if the phone is shut down. Then there are other initiatives like Space Out, which I think is being done with a lot of work from the Urban Redevelopment Authority here, where they record the number of people in supermarkets and in shopping malls, and you can see, past information to see kind of when are the hotspots, so that you avoid going to those places during times when they are crowded. There's something similar for the national parks to see. When people are in green areas, so that you don't have too many people congregating. So the two strategies generally are either to use it in contact tracing or to kind of track the density of people.
So basically it finds clusters of people and detect where there's a lot of people gathered together so that they could avoid those locations, right?
Yeah, so it's to inform the public, and then you can make an informed choice about where you're going to perform the activities. Obviously, there's potential to extend these systems, in various ways, so that you can actually, incorporate that information in your day planning and provide some feedback upstream. So we'll probably see these applications evolve in the course of the next few months as we all adjust to it becoming part of the normal.
Now, I was speaking to a prop tech guy before, and he was also mentioning about these sensors where they can detect gatherings, clusters of people, and trying to advise the building managers to avoid these clusters of people. And that's in the world of IoT. But in terms of AI, is there anything that we can, your projects can actually do to, predict something or give some recommendations to the public, the government, in order to disperse these people or even predict a certain social gathering from happening?
So my field is mainly in transportation and mobility. And in that sense, I mean, we use AI in our models, machine learning to extract the statistical regularities, of what we see, in the data, right? And so we'll continue to use those methods in advising, in operations planning, and so on. But our core focus is really to get an understanding of human behavior out of the data, and then make predictions from that. So if you have some idea that, if we have monitoring in the form of, let's say, cell phone data or so, that we can process in privacy compliant ways, and we can see evolving behavior in response to the pandemic, then we can feed that information into our models and then say, well, seeing as people behave in this way, this is likely what they will do if we make the following changes to the public transport system and the way that it operates, or if we let's say we implement a work from home strategy for 50% of the workforce. Who are those people supposed to be? Who should you target in your institution or in your company to be working from home? So where will the vulnerabilities be in the system? That's kind of how we are using it in our work and our research. But certainly, you can imagine that from IoT devices and all sorts of monitoring, you're going to have to be using a lot of AI and machine learning techniques, especially machine vision, to infer whether it's a bunch of people or a bunch of pigeons, kind of congregating in space, if you don't have a bunch of false positives. So I imagine that we'll see an explosion in the number of applications that employ AI in the coming weeks and months.
And has this been deployed already, or is it still in experimentation stage?
I mean, all of it is currently kind of experimentation that kind of has to go into high levels of technological readiness pretty fast. We're building on existing methods and adapting those. So you'll see, in the field of mobility, there's some interesting cases, like researchers at ETH Zurich under Kai Axhausen. Our colleague there, Joseph Malloy, has been doing a mobility study before the pandemic started, and the people that are participating in the study have devices that, where they report what they're doing and how they're moving and what they're using to move. And with that already in place, when the lockdown started, they could track on a daily basis how people are changing their mode of transport. And they saw that suddenly Zurich, even though it's nestled sort of with lots of mountains and valleys around it, suddenly became a cycling town, right? Because it's an obviously attractive mode of transportation under the current circumstances. So that's something that's ongoing. Then there are our colleagues in Berlin that have adapted a high technological readiness transport simulation, which we also use, to actually have the simulations of the virus spreading inside the transport simulation. So far, a lot of the models that we see, are not really taking much account of mobility and the fact that the spreading can happen in public transportation, and then also at the activity locations, at the other end. So Kai Nagel's group at the Technical University of Berlin has adapted the MATS, multi-agent transport simulation, to have a model of disease spreading inside it. And they use a digital twin population where the population, has the same composition and behavior of as the real one, but it's obviously not, it's synthetic, so there's no actual correspondence to real people, on a one-to-one basis, only in the aggregate properties of that system, which means that they can, model the dynamics for different vulnerable groups, because the population will have the same demographics as the real one. You'll have, old and vulnerable people, and you'll have younger people, and you can implement different strategies across those groups. Sorry, I think I've been drifting off the core
No, not
the
at all.
core question there.
Not at all. But I think a lot of the listeners might not even know what digital twin actually means. Can you explain to us a little bit more about what that means?
So digital twinning is just a kind of a buzzword that's used across a number of domains. It just means that you take something that's in the real world and you produce a copy of it in a computer simulation. In our case, our interest is in human mobility. If you're a disease modeler, your interest is in human health. So you would take the essential aspects of that, of that real world entity that you're interested in, and you would create a digital representation of it. In the case of human mobility and obviously human health and things where the security and privacy of human beings are coming into play, you need to be really careful about how you do it, so that you don't compromise the real world individuals. So what we do is we have methods where we only take aggregate information about the movement of people. But the aggregates that we take, my colleague Kwatimuk Anda currently with DataSpark has done his thesis on this work. The aggregate quantities that we take are interesting in the way that if you combine them together, you can produce a synthetic population. So you can produce a population of travelers that will exhibit those aggregate properties, but they are really traveling, as unique individuals inside a virtual city. It's a very roundabout way of doing it, but it just means that those synthetic individuals they don't correspond to any real person. They are just they just have the statistical properties of the real population, in the sense that you will have the same number of, let's say, 35-year-old females, living in a particular area than you have in the real world. But those 35-year-old females, won't be living in exactly the same spot as the real, ones are doing. So if you look at it from far away, it corresponds to the real population, but the closer you get, then that it starts to dissolve, so that you don't have a correspondence to individuals.
That's really interesting.
That might be
it's quite interesting to have a simulation of yourself living in a virtual world and predicting my activities. But does this really count for personality as well? Because that's something that I've been kind of interested in, because you can only predict a person's movements if you can really understand the person's character, their personality, and how they go about their lives. I mean, how does that get reflected into the digital twin?
So obviously we don't want to have the real world. There's not going to be a Takatoshi, Shibayama in the simulation. You'll find several individuals, synthetic individuals in the simulation that will have, superficially the same qualities as you do, and those entities will, on average, do the kinds of things that that at least whatever the resolution of the devices that you use permit the system to see. They will exhibit similar movements. So they might be traveling at least the same distance that you do in a day, and they might be visiting the same mix of activity locations as you do. But we're definitely not trying to get that deep into your head that we understand what the individual motivations are. It just works on really statistical might let's say, be working in the city center rather than, out in Geelong West, right? And based on that, in the city center, we know that, there are certain activity opportunities open to you during, let's say, lunchtime or so that aren't available to, in the western side of the island. And that is already enough information to start doing, to start doing planning in a meaningful way. Then you can say, okay, well, maybe, if I want people to stay at home, but they don't have any of those opportunities available at home, then maybe I should change some of my land use zoning decisions to start creating those opportunities or incentivize, certain opportunities in those areas. So we'd only need to know those statistical properties, and then use that to kind of calibrate the behavior of the synthetic individuals.
So these digital twins that are actually living in a simulator. So I guess these are just data collected from, cell phones or even identities of the people who are living in a country, and then so I guess the simulation is like, let's drop a virus into that system and see how that would spread. Is that how it works?
Yeah, I mean, the data can come from various sources, but what's important is that we only use aggregate data. So I don't get any single, we don't get any single individual's, record of locations that, that they've visited. It obviously the data companies will be, cannot release that. There are very clear ways in which they're allowed to monetize the data, which is typically, and the safest way is obviously aggregate data to say, okay, well, excuse me, in this 2 kilometer square area, from this area to this area at this time of day, so many people are moving. So that's the kind of resolution that we're working. So, and if you then string together aggregate information like that, so if you have, let's say, that kind of movement information on an hourly basis, plus, general information about the, for those different areas, what is the typical distance that people travel in a day, and what is the typical number of activity locations that they visit. You start putting all of that together, then in the right way, then you can build this synthetic population such that it will also exhibit those properties. So it's really a construction from just very aggregate information. What was the second part of the question? Oh yeah, then you drop the virus in there. Exactly. So what you would do is currently how Kai Nagel's group is doing it, and maybe I can send you the link so you can post it with the podcast. Is they have a disease spread modeling, or disease spread model coupled with the simulation, the mobility simulation. And yeah, these synthetic individuals, they are, susceptible or infected or recovered or, passed away. Hopefully not too many. You drop them in the simulation and you put in the policies that are currently, being implemented or that you plan to implement. So if you want to see that, let's say 50% of the guys stay home, they will be spreading the virus, inside the household if they're already infected. So that synthetic individuals are also grouped together in households of different sizes. And you will see a different disease spread than when they're taking, public transportation in a very crowded train or waiting at a crowded platform or, going to the office. And you can take account of all sorts of information. If you know the office has got a high floor area ratio, or it has, it's relatively open, you can adjust the disease spreading dynamics in response to that. But the big problem right now is that, a lot of the information about the disease spreading dynamics is still emerging, as we know from the fact that, we're wearing masks now when it was previously said not to do. So the best thing that you can do right now is to plan for all sorts of variation to kind of deal with the the fact that you cannot know the dynamics perfectly yet.
Yeah, with the use of this company that we were talking about initially, Blue Dot, that locates where viruses spread out. I mean, this was very accurate because this global airlines reservation data with that data, they predicted that the virus from Wuhan would spread to Seoul, Taipei,
Yeah,
Tokyo, and then with that simulation, you can say, well, if that virus from Wuhan actually landed in Singapore, how would that spread across all over Singapore, right? And then you can implement procedures. Maybe a lockdown is one way, but I'm sure there's a lot of different ways that we can go about doing this. I mentioned many times in this podcast before that the lockdown was used in 1918 during the Spanish flu, and we're reusing this right now, and it's destroying the global economy, right? And then now in the U.S., we've seen riots of these things happening. A lot of small businesses are going to be, demolished during this time. So
yeah.
how can we use these smart AI prediction models to prevent us from going into the same situation that we are right now?
So I think this kind of opens up what are the different approaches in which we can use the big data, right? On the one hand, you can use it for active monitoring, which is the contact tracing route. On the other hand, you can use it in a way to design for a system that's more resilient. Certainly, the things like this Space Out, website. There's not much in the way of actual AI in there, but there is normal intelligence, right, of people on the other end, kind of responding to information and in making more informed decisions. So before we rely on AI, I think that's we should look at relying on human intelligence as far as possible, and ask people to use their common sense. If you know that you're in a vulnerable group, then you should be allowed to work from home, and that there shouldn't be any stigma associated with that decision. Then, when it comes to using AI, I think we have to ask ourselves firstly, what are we going to be comfortable with in terms of the data privacy? So, yes, these things can do a lot, like you say, from Blue Dot, but ultimately, if they are to make improve predictions, we have to give them massive access, right? So we have to not only give them movement access, but then also about which individuals have actually become infected, which is incredibly scary to put that kind of trust, in some organization, right? So I think that's one of the first things that we need to take care of before we let open the floodgates, because definitely, yeah, if it has perfect knowledge, these algorithms are capable of seeing patterns that we are unable to detect. I've recently been working on a proposal where kind of the one part of me says that maybe this shouldn't be allowed, but they are definitely notions to explore, like if we are able to pick up signals of early detection, like let's say variations in your core body temperature or something like that, then it would be possible to to pick up very early where some asymptomatic spread might be occurring or so. But then I realized that maybe that's great, but we first need the infrastructure in place to deal with that kind of sensitive information in a secure way that we're not compromising. So I think there's a lot of stuff that we need to have in place before we let the companies and machines loose on such sensitive information. Because I'm sure that it can work, but I'm not sure if I'm comfortable with with releasing that kind of information to others. And we can see it in the way that, you know, certain governments are responding. Like in Germany, they are not going to go the contact tracing route. So that's why they're all about testing and monitoring. And yeah, then it becomes a question of, you know, if you see a cluster, then, you know, obviously the ability to see clusters or potential for clusters is also a task that you can assign to AI, and you can inform it with past clusters of you know, of transmission that have occurred, and make some predictions, even just at the kind of aggregate level with that information.
Yeah, I just kind of thought about the movie called Minority Report, where these sinks, I forgot what they're called, but they did predict the person's criminal activity even before they happen. So it's not at that level, but it'll be kind of scary if some government official comes over to my house and said, "Oh, we detected your body temperature going up, so we're going to take you away and quarantine you for 14 days." You know, this kind of
Yeah,
action is a little bit scary because, yeah, in one hand, it does predict. Sorry, it actually helps people getting infected from these contagious diseases, but also they're dealing with our private data. And whether it's the government or for-profit companies, it's very hard to understand how they deal with these data. And who
yeah,
knows when the governments or these companies go rogue on you and monetize you for certain things like the Facebook and Cambridge Analytica kind of thing. So,
yeah.
what are some ways that we can protect our privacy, or what's the direction that we can take this AI and these big data so that we can prevent or even have a good balance with privacy and a safety of our people?
Um, I think the fact that we're currently doing everything in a trust environment is the biggest problem, right? So we need to move to trustless systems. Uh, so that means going open source and, you know, using technology like you know, blockchain, distributed ledger stuff. Um, we need to, you know, when it comes to personal tracking devices, Google and Apple have been talking about embedding contact tracing capabilities into their core operating system. This should really make all of us worried. The fact that those two behemoths are actually agreeing on that. I don't know. Maybe one day I want to go and work for Google, so I shouldn't be too critical. But but a good start would be to have an open source phone operating system that you can actually compile and build, you know, install yourself. And that might sound preposterous, you know, to most companies now, but if I can see the code, and not just me, because maybe I'm not such an expert, but there are lots of experts out there that can take a look at the code and say, yeah, this thing is actually doing what it says on the box. It's encrypting your data and treating it in a way that it's impossible, you know, for them to reconstruct, let's say, from your trajectory, who you are and where you live. The fact that our phones are repositories of not just our movement information now, but our medical information and financial, you know, information. All these data streams can be joined together in ways that you cannot imagine, especially if you leave it to a machine to go and do the joining. And combined now with that, so not only where you spend your money and where you go to work and where you live, but also who you get in touch with. It just opens up massive, you know, vulnerabilities, because I might not be able to get to you directly, but maybe I can find somebody in the system that I can compromise you with. So yeah, opening it up, and then I might be agreeable to, you know, to install this kind of tracking on my phone. And then when it comes to the processing of this data, you know, there are platforms like Tron, for instance, you know, there's smart contracts, right? So a smart contract is just a way that this device in the blockchain is going to process information. And things like Tron will allow you to launch a virtual machine that's completely encrypted, completely black box, that you know, that can independently process the way in a way that is completely clear to to everybody, and you can make do decision making from there. And the rules can be set by the open source community about what is allowed and what is not. But as long as these things are behind institutional walls or proprietary walls, then I am loath to give them that level of access. So then I would rather turn to what can you do with aggregate data. Like I said, you can do this digital twinning, and that can allow you to design policies and operations that are robust. For instance, in the digital twin, we can already get a pretty good idea, even though it's not the real Singapore, but we could get an idea of what's the size of the contact network of our virtual Singapore, in terms of, within how many days is one person in contact with every other person. So from a previous study that my colleague Lee Jun Sun has done with Kai Exhausen and Prof. Darren Lee from NUS, they found from the smart card data that it's about 3 days that it takes for you to have been in contact, through various people meeting each other or with every other individual in the city, right? So we can design transit systems to avoid that kind of thing. So there are various ideas about how we might go about doing that, maybe pre-booking transportation or designing the network in such a way that we don't get clusters of people, at different locations building up. Yeah, I think those are the two ways of dealing with it, either in just using aggregate data or having a system where it's clear exactly to everybody how the data is being processed and nobody actually owns that data.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much. I mean, I think we really have a good idea of how you're working on these AI and IoT projects within our Singapore Smart City projects. So hopefully in the next pandemic, we can actually have a better way to spend our times either working from home or working outside of home, but definitely not in a situation where everybody has to be locked down and no social activities of any sort. That ultimately causes a lot of anxieties to people, mental breakdowns, destroying economies. We can all prevent that from next time.
Yeah, let's hope so.
All right, thanks.
All right, Taka.
All right, good. Hi, this is your host Takatoshi Shibayama. Thank you for listening all the way to the end. Now, if you enjoyed or disliked this show, please let me know by writing in the comment section. The only way I can improve or add value to you is through your voices. If there are any topics that you would like me to pick up, please also let me know in the comments. I'd love to start chatting with you all. And if you would like to continue watching the show, please subscribe. Thank you.